In February of 1542, a teenage girl was executed at the Tower of London, convicted of treason for crimes that, by some accounts, her husband, the same king who had once broken from the Catholic Church for the woman before her, ordered her death with barely a flicker of hesitation. This is the story of Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, thrust into a marriage in a court she was almost entirely unprepared for. Was she a calculating adulteress who betrayed her king, or a naive teenager, groomed and exploited by older men both before and during her marriage, ultimately destroyed by a court that offered her no genuine protection? Her story is one of the most uncomfortable and revealing chapters in the entire history of the Tudor court. Catherine Howard was born into one of England's most powerful noble families, the Howards, related by blood to the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most influential men in the kingdom, and, notably, a cousin of Anne Boleyn herself, Henry's second wife, who had been executed 6 years before. Catherine's own rise to prominence. Despite this powerful family name, Catherine's own immediate upbringing was marked by considerable neglect. Her mother died when she was young, and her father, Edmund Howard, struggled financially and held, as a result, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a common practice among noble families of the era, where large households of young wards and servants lived together with minimal direct supervision. This household arrangement, though standard for the period, a detail that would prove critically important to understanding the events of Catherine's later life. Historical accounts describe a household where young women, including Catherine, mixed relatively freely with music teachers, secretaries, and other young men attached to the household, with far less strict chaperoning. It was within this loosely supervised environment, relationships that historians studying the later evidence believe involved a significant power imbalance, involved with older men in positions of some authority within the household itself. The first of these relationships involved Henry May, Duchess's household to instruct Catherine and other young women in the household on the virtue, a common musical instrument of the era. Mannix, considerably older than Catherine and of significantly lower social status, began what later testimony described as an inappropriate physical relationship with her, one that by modern standards would be unambiguously recognized as the grooming and sexual exploitation of a child by an adult in a position of authority over her. Though the specific legal and social frameworks of the time, when this relationship was eventually discovered by the Dowager Duchess, and the relationship with Catherine, apparently continued in some diminished form even afterward. Shortly after, Catherine's attention, or perhaps more accurately, the attention directed at her, shifted to Francis Derham, several years older than Catherine and considerably more assertive in pursuing her. Derham and Catherine purportedly entered into a relationship that included physical intimacy, and one that Derham himself, along with several other members of the household, later described using language suggesting they considered themselves informally betrothed or pre-contracted to marry, a legally significant distinction under the marriage customs of the period, since a formal pre-contract could be considered legally binding in ways that would complicate any future marriage Catherine might enter into. This relationship with Derham became something of an open secret within the crowded, loosely supervised household, with several other young women later testifying, and some indicating that Derham had referred to conversation. When the Dowager Duchess eventually discovered this relationship as well, more alarmed than she had toward the earlier situation with Man, over what she viewed as scandalous behavior that could damage the family's reputation, Derham was eventually sent away from the household, traveling to Ireland to pursue other opportunities, while Catherine, still a teenager, remained within the Howard family's orbit. Her earlier relationships apparently considered closed chapters, precisely the kind of arrangement common among noble families managing scandal in this era, but one that would return with devastating consequences once Catherine's profile rose dramatically within just a few short years. By 1539, Catherine Howard secured a position at the royal court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, a marriage that had been arranged for primarily political and diplomatic reasons, tying England to Protestant German. This position brought Catherine directly into the orbit of the royal court, and by extension, into the direct line of sight of King Henry himself. Now in his late 40s, increasingly unwell with a painful and worsening leg ulcer, and visibly aging in ways that made him acutely self-conscious about his declining physical vigor and appeal, Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves had been, by most accounts, a personal disappointment for the king from its very beginning, with Henry reportedly displeased with her appearance upon their first meeting and finding little genuine personal connection or attraction in the match. It was within this context of marital dissatisfaction and personal insecurity about his own aging body that Henry first took notice of young Catherine Howard, whose youthful energy, physical attractiveness, in a pattern of infatuation with a younger woman at court that echoed Catherine of Aragon's own household years before. The powerful and politically ambitious Howard family, along with the broader conservative, Catholic faction at court, led by Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, recognized immediately the tremendous political opportunity Henry's interest in young Catherine represented. This faction had been engaged in an ongoing political struggle against Protestant faction at court, and installing a Howard family member as queen, replacing the Cleves marriage that Cromwell himself had arranged and championed. Whether Catherine herself was an eager and willing participant in this political maneuvering, or largely a passive figure whose family and faction actively pushed her toward the king with considerably more enthusiasm and calculation than she, remains genuinely debated among historians studying her brief and tragic life, would have had extremely limited, genuine agency to resist such powerful family and political pressure even had she wished to. Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was formally annulled in July of 1540, on the grounds that Anne had previously been pre-contracted to another suitor. Technical legal justifications that conveniently allowed Henry to end the marriage without the more dramatic and internationally damaging spectacle of a divorce or execution. Remarkably, Anne of Cleves handled this outcome with considerable grace and political shrewdness, agreeing to the annulment without significant resistance and being rewarded with a generous settlement of estates and the honorary, allowing her to live out the remainder of her life in comfortable and dignified independence in England, an outcome that stands in stark and sobering contrast to the fates of several of Henry's other wives. Just weeks after this annulment, on the 28th of July, 1540, the very same day that Thomas Cromwell, Henry's former chief minister and the architect of the Cleves marriage, was executed on charges of treason and heresy, a downfall closely tied to the political victory of the conservative Howard faction. Henry married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony. The timing of these two events on the very same day, Cromwell's execution and Henry's new marriage, was almost certainly not coincidental, symbolically marking the decisive political triumph of the conservative Catholic faction at court over the reform-minded faction Cromwell had led. Henry, now approaching 50 years old and increasingly burdened by declining health, appeared utterly besotted with his new young bride, and showering her with gifts, attention, and public displays of affection that observers at court described as remarkable for a king who had, in recent years, seemed increasingly weary and irritable. For a period of several months following the wedding, the royal court took on an atmosphere of celebration and renewed vitality, with Henry appearing rejuvenated by his young wife's presence, hosting lavish entertainments and progresses around the country that, for Catherine herself, this period represented an extraordinary and dizzying transformation, from a relatively obscure young woman within a large and loosely supervised, noble household to the Queen of England, adorned in magnificent jewels and gowns, and the object of the king's evident devotion. Yet beneath this glittering surface, Dereham remained a dangerous, unaddressed vulnerability, one that would soon resurface with catastrophic consequences, as Henry and Catherine embarked on an extensive royal progress through the northern counties of England. A seemingly minor personnel decision set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately destroy Catherine entirely. Catherine's former lover from her days in the Dowager Duchess's household, had returned from Ireland, secured a position within Catherine's own household as her secretary, a decision historians have long puzzled over given the obvious risk it represented, though it may reflect either Catherine's own poor judgment or some combination of naivety and calculated risk-taking on Catherine's part. Around this same period, Catherine also began a considerably more dangerous and clearly adulterous relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a young gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. Marriage to Henry, unlike her earlier relationships with Manox and Derham, which had occurred before her marriage and arguably before she was old enough to be considered capable of full legal consent under any reasonable modern standard, making it unambiguously treasonous adultery under the laws of the time, laws that treated a queen's infidelity as a direct threat to the security and legitimate succession of the crown itself. Catherine and Culpeper reportedly arranged secret meetings during the royal progress, facilitated by Lady Jane Ross, the widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother George, who served as one of Catherine's ladies, and who historians believe acted as a direct facilitator and lookout for these clandestine encounters, a decision that would ultimately cost Rochford her own life alongside Catherine's when the affair was eventually discovered. The precise physical extent of Catherine's relationship with Culpeper remains debated among historians, with some evidence suggesting the relationship may have remained primarily emotional and flirtatious, rather than fully consummated, though the surviving testimony and correspondence Catherine to Culpeper discovered among his possessions made the romantic and dangerously indiscreet nature of the relationship unmistakably clear to investigators. Once the affair came to light, the unraveling of Catherine's carefully hidden secrets, when a former acquaintance from Catherine's days in the revealed details of Catherine's earlier relationships with Manox and Derham to her own brother, John Lascelles, a committed religious reformer with connections to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the very same clergyman who had earlier annulled Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. Lascelles, whether motivated by genuine moral concern or a combination of both, brought this information directly to Cranmer, who faced an extraordinarily delicate decision about whether and how to bring such damaging allegations about the Queen to the King's attention. Cranmer ultimately chose to deliver the information to Henry in a written document rather than verbally, purportedly out of genuine fear of the King's potential violent reaction to such devastating news delivered in person. Henry's initial reaction was reportedly one of complete disbelief, refusing to accept the allegations, to clear her name and expose what he assumed must be malicious and false accusations against her. However, as investigators began questioning Derham and various members of the Dowager Duchess's former household, it increasingly impossible to maintain any credible doubt about the basic facts of Catherine's earlier relationships. Derham revealed the existence of Catherine's more recent and far more dangerous relationship with Thomas Culpeper, information that transformed the entire investigation from a matter of premarital indiscretion, embarrassing but not necessarily treasonous, into a matter of potential treason, adultery committed during her marriage to the King, a categorically more serious offense carrying the automatic penalty of death. Henry's reaction to this escalating revelation was purportedly devastation and explosive rage. Upon fully absorbing the scope of Catherine's deception, weeping openly before advisors, a rare public display of vulnerability from a monarch not typically given to such open emotional expression, followed quickly by a cold, methodical determination to see the full truth extracted and appropriate punishment administered without mercy. Catherine herself was questioned, ostensibly by Archbishop Cranmer and other royal officials, and her responses during this period reveal a young woman, likely still only around 19 years old, in a state of genuine terror and psychological collapse. Surviving accounts describe Catherine alternating between denial, confusion, and partial admissions regarding her earlier relationships with Manox and Derham, while more firmly, though ultimately unsuccessfully, denying that her relationship with Culpeper had involved any physical infidelity during her marriage. Under further investigation, however, the evidence against her continued to mount. The letter Catherine had written to Culpeper, discovered among his possessions, contained language that investigators considered damning in its intimacy and clear indication of an ongoing romantic relationship, regardless of the precise physical extent of their encounters. Lady Jane Rochford, questioned about her role in facilitating the meetings between Catherine and Culpeper, though Rochford herself reportedly experienced some form of psychological breakdown during this period, with contemporary accounts suggesting she may have suffered what would today likely be recognized as a serious mental health crisis brought on by the extraordinary stress and danger of her situation. Crucially, investigators determined that Catherine's earlier relationship with Francis Dear, given the informal language of betrothal and marriage that witnesses recalled from that period, could potentially have constituted marriage customs of the era. This raised a genuinely significant legal question. Her marriage to the king might be considered legally invalid from the outset, which would have technically meant she could not be guilty of treasonous adultery as queen. However, rather than pursuing this line of defense, which might have spared her life while sacrificing her status and reputation entirely, the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings moved forward on the assumption that her marriage to Henry was valid, and that her conduct both before and during that marriage constituted grounds for treason, a legal approach that ensured the harshest possible outcome for Catherine, regardless of which specific legal theory was ultimately applied to her situation. Rather than proceeding through the normal process of a formal trial, where Catherine would have had at least some limited opportunity to mount a legal defense, Parliament instead passed a Bill of Attainder in early 1542 that allowed for a formal declaration of guilt and sentence of death, without the procedural protections. This approach had been used previously against Thomas Cromwell and would be used again in later English history, and it reflected the extent to which the outcome of Catherine's case had already been predetermined by the overwhelming weight of testimony and evidence gathered during the investigation, making a formal trial seem, to those managing the process, an unnecessary and potentially risky formality. The Bill of Attainder formally condemned both Catherine and Lady, concealing the various relationships under investigation. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper had already been tried separately in December of 1541 and found guilty of treason, with Culpeper granted the somewhat, while Derham suffered the far more brutal traditional punishment for treason of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Their severed heads subsequently displayed on London Bridge as a public warning, a grim and visible reminder of the fate awaiting those who betrayed the crown. Henry himself, purportedly still deeply wounded by Catherine's betrayal, did not personally attend or preside over these final legal proceedings against his young wife, a departure from his more direct involvement in the downfall of some of his earlier wives, and some historians interpret this distance as reflecting the genuine depth of his personal devastation and humiliation over the entire affair, a wound to his pride and self-image as much as to any genuine emotional attachment, given how thoroughly and publicly his infatuation with Catherine had been displayed to the court and the wider kingdom during their brief marriage. On the 13th of February, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London, on the very same execution grounds where her cousin, Anne Boleyn, had been put to death less than 6 years earlier. That was almost certainly not lost on contemporaries observing the proceedings. Accounts of her final days describe Catherine as having initially remained in a state of considerable distress and denial, purportedly requesting that the block be brought to her cell the night before so that she could practice, speaks to both the horror of her situation and a determination to meet her death with whatever dignity remained possible under the circumstances. In her final speech on the scaffold, following the conventions expected of condemned nobles of the era, Catherine reportedly acknowledged the justice of her sentence and asked for prayers, though she notably did not deliver the kind of extensive, carefully staged final statement that her cousin, Anne Boleyn, had given years earlier. Some later, likely apocryphal accounts claim. She declared she would rather have died the wife of Culpeper than Queen of England, a dramatic statement that, while emotionally resonant and frequently repeated in popular retellings of her story, lacks solid contemporary documentation and should be treated with considerable historical skepticism. Lady Jane Rochford was executed immediately following Catherine, her role in facilitating the Queen's dangerous liaisons, having sealed her own fate alongside her mistress's. Catherine's execution, at approximately 19 or 20 years old by most historians' estimates, though her exact birth year remains uncertain, made her one of the youngest of Henry's wives and arguably the one whose story most starkly illustrates the profound power imbalance and complete lack of genuine protection afforded to young women, placed within the dangerous political currents of the Tudor court, regardless of the crown jewels and temporary devotion that had briefly elevated her to queen.